So good morning to everyone that's joined. A huge welcome and thank you for joining our webinar, Beyond Furlough, the Next Step. My name's Susie Hughes. I'm the Operations Director for Gleeson Recruitment Group. And I'm really excited to be partnering with Irwin Mitchell on the webinar today. So I'd like to introduce Helen Dyke. Helen's a Senior Associate from Irwin Mitchell. She will be your host for the meeting. Helen's joined by her colleague, Joanne Mosley, and Joanne is a practice development lawyer at Irwin Mitchell as well. So Helen, if I can pass over to you now, and I will wrap up the call at the end. So thank you.
So yes, thank you very much to Gleeson and to Susie for asking Irwin Mitchell to help you this morning with the current position. So we're obviously looking at where we're at currently, and then beyond furlough, what the next steps are. So we'll run through that with you this morning. Welcome to everybody that's joining. We're at about 56 participants, which is brilliant. Thank you very much for spending the time this morning. I've also got my colleague with me, Joanne Mosley, who's our professional support lawyer in our employment team in Birmingham at Irwin Mitchell. So Jo has been publishing a lot of the guidance notes and helping a lot of our clients with making their way through the situation that we're in. So just to have a quick look at the agenda then for this morning. So as I say, we're looking at beyond furlough really. We're focusing on the next steps. And then looking at the latest position. So things have been changing very, very rapidly. There has been a huge amount of change, sometimes on a daily basis. And it's been very difficult for employers to keep on top of it. So we as lawyers have been doing our best to assist clients to make sure that they know what the latest position is. We're then going to move on to looking at the return to work. So obviously now businesses are very much focusing their minds on what they have to do to make sure that their staff are protected and to make sure that they can get back to business as far as they possibly can. That's going to mean that possibly you're going to have to look at the contracts of employees. So we're going to run through the process of changing terms and conditions and making sure that you do that safely. And then unfortunately, a lot of our clients are having to talk to us now about redundancy plans and restructuring. So obviously there's a real need to make cost savings. And part of that, sadly, is going to be having to look at reviewing the position around the staff structure that you've got and potentially looking at redundancies if you have to as a last resort. So we will move on to that. We're going to take questions as we go. So there is a Q&A box that you should see at the bottom of your screen. So please do, as we go, put your questions in. So we've got those 4 key topics. As we move through those 4 topics, just shout out and Jo is kindly going to review your questions and help me to answer those. So just a quick recap really on furlough, the basics. Now furlough, relatively new and strange concept to us that we've all had to quickly get to grips with. It has been an interesting few weeks whilst we've grappled with the concept of furlough, what that means for businesses and for employees. As we know, the coronavirus job retention scheme was introduced by the government a while ago. The scheme runs from the 1st of March and now through to the 31st of October. But after the 31st of July, the scheme will be made more flexible. So currently the scheme pays up to 80% of wages, and that's up to a maximum of £2,500 per month. There is the possibility there for businesses to top up if they want to, but that is the grant that's being paid by the government. And it's available to a whole range of workers. So there was uncertainty at the outset as to who it would apply to, but it does apply to any staff that are part-time, casual staff, 0-hour staff, etc. So it's a huge scheme with a huge cost as well. There's more detailed guidance as we understand it on the latest changes to the scheme. So those changes were announced this week, and we're expecting the more detailed guidance from the government around about the middle of May. So we'll have to wait and see what that says. So in terms of the principles of furlough then, so firstly, it's a change to the employee's contract. So that means we go back to basic employment law. The employee has to agree to be furloughed. So that's really important that you get agreement and you get it in writing so that you've got that documentary evidence. And the government guidance has specified that the furlough period must last for a minimum of 3 weeks. You can do clever things like rotating staff and swapping them so that there's fairness between teams, but ultimately it has to last for a minimum of 3 weeks. And employees are not permitted to do any work for their employer whilst they're furloughed, but they can work for other organisations, which seems a bit strange, but that is the government guidance, that they can't work for their employer, but they can do work elsewhere. And we've had a few clients that have opted to work at other places, such as, helping out the NHS. That's all subject to their contracts, though. So there will be, almost certainly there will be clauses in your employment contracts that prevent staff from working elsewhere. So they would generally need to let you know that that's what they're planning to do and get your agreement to do that in line with their contract. So there's been quite a few issues, to say the least, for employers in terms of dealing with the furlough scheme, and you really have had to keep on top of the changes. The reality is that it has been far more complicated than we expected, particularly around what is and isn't included in the pay. So the government has updated its guidance to employers on multiple times. They had a bit of they really particularly enjoyed changing the guidance on a Friday late afternoon, which was brilliant because we'd have to work over the weekend to get updates to clients. So yes, multiple changes and lots of moving of goalposts. And as we've just said, they're still updating the guidance. Now, the guidance can be inconsistent in places. Sometimes it just contradicts the rules. So there is a direction that sets out the law behind this, and there are contradictions within it. So that's not been great for businesses to deal with. The portal declaration. Now, many of you will have gone through the portal process already in order to get the furlough grant payment. And within that process, you have to declare as a business that the cost of employing furloughed employees arise from health, social and economic emergencies resulting from the coronavirus. And the information has to be correct to the best of your knowledge. The claim is in accordance with HMRC's published guidance, which you do need to review. And you have to confirm that employees have been paid or will be paid. So if information changes, then you're required to contact HMRC. So that's the general portal process. Now, obviously, you're generally inputting that for potentially a large number of employees. And we're required as businesses to keep documents for a 5-year period. So we don't know what the process will be in terms of HMRC checking that the information provided has been accurate, but there is that risk that there could be subsequently an audit or an investigation. So we need to make sure that the information is accurate that we're inputting. So Jo, there are some grey areas around furlough, aren't there? And we've had to grapple with this for clients. So just thinking about the agreement to furlough and the issue around having actual agreement, or will a written record be enough? What's your view on that?
Well, as you've said, Helen, the direction flatly contradicts what's already in the guidance that was published to employers, and many employers took advantage of the furlough scheme well before the official rules were published. And they followed those rules, and it simply said that your employees needed to agree and that you needed to put that in writing. So that meant that you could simply confirm that an employee had given you verbal confirmation that they were happy to be furloughed, whereas the direction actually says that it needs to be a formal written agreement. The the government have said via Twitter, which is not the best place in which to publish information, that all employers need to do is follow the guidance. And as you've just said in relation to the declaration, it's the guidance that you are confirming you've followed. Therefore, our view is that if you have already furloughed staff, there isn't a need to go back and obtain a written agreement from them. But if you're yet to furlough staff, it's a good idea to actually have a written agreement in place rather than a confirmatory email or letter.
Okay. Yeah, perfect sense. And we've had some clients, haven't we, that have said, well, it was such a rush at the start. We had conversations with staff, and they've just gone on furlough, and they seem happy enough, but we've got no verbal or written confirmation from them. And what would you say in that sort of scenario?
I think that if HMRC do challenge on the basis of the absence of a written agreement, providing you can demonstrate that your staff were on furlough, weren't working, and were paid the furlough's monies, it's difficult to see really what they can complain about other than a technical breach. Yeah.
Okay, but always best to get the written agreement if you possibly can.
Absolutely it is. Yeah, absolutely.
Get that chased up if you can. Okay, and we've had some issues, haven't we, for clients around sick leave and the issues around whether you can furlough employees on SSP or do you have to wait for that sick period to end?
Well, again, this is where the advice that was given to employers varies from the official rules. The advice to employers says, yes, you can furlough people that are on sick leave, but you can't pay them both SSP and the furlough grant. You have to pay one or the other. However, the official rules say that you cannot furlough someone in receipt of SSP if it's their first period of absence. Now, that's okay if you're talking about somebody, for example, that's self-isolated for 14 days. But when you're talking about someone that is shielding, the new legislation in relation to SSP provides that they're entitled to SSP for at least 12 weeks. So if they are receiving that SSP for the first 12 weeks, it could mean that they aren't eligible to be furloughed until that initial 12-week period is over. Now, that will cause them significant financial hardship because, as you know, SSP is paid at the princely sum of £95 a week, whereas furloughed salary is up to £2,500 a month. There's a huge disconnect between those two. And it's really difficult, actually, to advise clients about the best way to approach this. And I know that some are erring on the side of caution and saying, well, look, the rules say this, therefore we cannot furlough you until 12 weeks if you're shielding, which seems nonsensical when you consider that if you are living with somebody who is shielding, you can furlough them because they're not entitled to SSP. So living with someone that is shielding, you're actually better off financially than if you're in the unfortunate position of having these conditions that require you to stay inside the house.
Yeah, which is crazy, isn't it? And we've had, I think we're going to see this more and more as people are concerned about returning to work. They've got people that are vulnerable at home, or they themselves have conditions that they're concerned about, and just the general fear of coming back into work and into the cities. It's going to be an ongoing issue, isn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay. So in terms of the latest developments then on furlough, so as we say, from the 1st of August, we've had this announcement this week that there is the extension, which should hopefully be good news. I know for a fact that many clients have already put on hold their plans for redundancies. So hopefully this extension will mean that they can get through the next period and get back to normal. So from the 1st of August, workers can return part-time but claim furlough for full-time hours. And this is what we're expecting, certainly by the end of May, mid-May, hopefully, with the government's guidance on this as to how exactly it's going to work. But the government will be reducing the amount it will pay and employers will have to then top up those payments. So it's a gradual easing back into normality. Employees must continue to receive 80% of pay up to the 2,500 cap. And the scheme remains open for all industries in all regions, even those that are open. There was some question originally about whether particular sectors wouldn't be eligible, but that is the case now as it stands, that this scheme will continue for all sectors, which is good news. And then in terms of exit plans, so this is really now what businesses are focusing their minds on in terms of getting back to business as normal as you possibly can, and ending furlough, bringing employees back to work on their previous terms and conditions, or, as we'll come to, making changes if they need to. So I think many businesses are going to have to look at, unfortunately, reducing payroll costs, and if possible, without making redundancies. You know, we don't want to do that if we can avoid it. So we've got the extension on the furlough scheme on either the same or the revised terms, with or without the benefit of the job retention scheme. There's the option of ending furlough and bringing employees back to work on reduced hours and reduced pay. And that's obviously a change, so you'd need to get that agreement from the employee, and we'll talk about that. Or there's the option to end furlough and bring employees back to work on reduced pay at the same hours, which obviously is not going to be particularly palatable to staff. So things to think about in terms of how you get your staff back to work. There's the option there of offering unpaid or part paid leave or sabbaticals if you need some breathing space before you get staff back. So that's another option to think about. And that might be relevant, for example, for those that are shielding or have vulnerable people at home, something to think about there. And then ultimately, we've got the option of redundancies and reducing headcount if we have to do that. So getting staff back to work, what do you have to do? And this is really now what we're focusing our minds on in terms of what's the return to work plan. We've seen a number of clients putting plans together and focusing on what the buildings look like, what you have to do with your people, and what specific practices you need to implement in order to make it safe. And, you will have seen a lot of news in the press around unions getting particularly interested on this point. So if you're a unionised business, then you do need to make sure that you actively work with the unions on your return to work plan and get their agreement on that. Johnson obviously said on Sunday, I'm sure you will watch the announcement, that employees are now actively encouraged to return to work if their employer is allowed to open, and they can't work from home. So obviously the ideal is that staff still continue to work from home if that is possible. You also need to think about transport. So obviously staff have to be able to get to work safely. You need to be able to reassure them on that. The government, as it stands, is asking us not to use public transport where we possibly can avoid it. There's a real focus on cycling. We've had lots of clients talk to us about cycle schemes and walking where you possibly can. That's just not going to be viable for a lot of businesses. So it's something that you need to bear in mind, something that we haven't really had to think about before in terms of making sure our staff can get to work safely. So it's not a case of just, hi.
Sorry, I was just saying it's worth mentioning also that the government has published a guidance note on travel now, which came out on Tuesday, and that talks specifically about how people should use public transport if they've got no other way of getting into work. And that includes things like, taking longer perhaps to get into work, not getting onto crowded services, to try and take the most direct route and walk if that makes the journey easier, not to eat or drink on any public services, and to use a face covering whilst you're travelling too.
Yeah. The face covering has been a real issue, hasn't it, and been hotly debated in the media. So now they are recommending that we use that. So it might be a case that you have to look at sourcing masks for staff. And
well,
hopefully
what it's saying on that, Helen, is that if you provide masks, they should be ones that are non-medical, because obviously all of the masks need to go to the frontline services. So they're talking about, you know, putting a cloth mask or a scarf mask, or have you seen those weird sock masks that people are making these days? They're chopping up their socks and shoving those over their mush.
Arms of T-shirts I've seen as well. Yeah.
Right, okay.
Lots of creative ways of doing it, but I mean, it's just crazy, isn't it, that we're having to think about this in order to get our staff safely to work. But it is something that we need to think about. We can't just open the doors and carry on as normal. It's just not going to be possible, and you will get staff that are very, very concerned about coming back in. So thinking about health and safety obligations, financial implications, and employment law, it's a lot to deal with as a business. And HR professionals have had to adapt very, very quickly to all of these changes and learn as we go. In terms of the government guidance then on getting people back to work, that has been produced very, very quickly and released this week. So there are 8 documents now for various different sectors. We've got retail, offices, construction, and so on. Each really focus on the 5 practical steps for getting staff back to work. So again, emphasising work from home if you possibly can. And I think the work from home point is an interesting one in terms of, as a sort of separate point, in terms of, you know, the changing culture of work. So I think there's going to be a lot more requests from staff to continue working from home after this pandemic. And we're starting to see from surveys of staff that that's something that has been a real benefit to them, that flexibility. So I think that's something that we need to think about as we move forward. Obviously, risk assessments are absolutely critical. So risk assessments for your building, for staff, they will have to be done on a case-by-case basis for certain staff that perhaps have conditions that you need to think about, or pregnant staff, and social distancing. So the rules are regularly being updated by the government in terms of social distancing. We've got that 2-metre rule that we need to focus on and make sure that we can allow staff back into the building. That's going to be easier said than done. You might need to think about rotas, seating plans, that sort of thing. So we've seen businesses look at taping off certain desks so that you can make sure that you've got the space between staff. And then generally looking at how you manage the risk of transmission if it is difficult to maintain social distancing. And how the likes of schools with young children are going to do this, I have no idea. But for businesses, that is something that you need to think about. So things like lifts, that's going to be an issue. Stairways, obviously toilets, kitchens, anywhere where people convene. You need to make sure that you've done a risk assessment on those areas. And cleaning processes are going to be hugely, hugely important. So that should all feature in detail in your return to work plan. Now, obviously, this guidance from the government applies to England only, and the likes of Nicola Sturgeon have made it very clear that the rules in Scotland and then obviously equally for Northern Ireland and Wales are separate to what we're doing in England. So if you've got businesses across the UK, sites in Northern Ireland, Wales and Scotland, or indeed if you've got staff that need to go to those areas, then that is something that you're going to have to think about, that we've got a different approach. So just focusing on risk assessments then, there is this requirement to be COVID secure, which is the phrase that's being used, and to reduce the risk to the lowest practicable level. So what does that mean? Well, HSE have updated their general guidance. So employers have to identify what work activity or situations might cause transmission of the virus. So that then goes back to your risk assessment. So you're thinking about who could be at risk. You're deciding how likely it is that someone could be exposed, and you're acting to remove the activity or the situation. If it's not possible, you're looking to control the risk. So again, it's thinking about the practicalities. How does this work for your premises? So really important that you do that in detail and think about those areas that I mentioned, you know, the kitchen, the bathroom, stairs and lifts. Those are going to be particular areas of concern. Now, it might require collective consultation, particularly if you've got safety representatives or if you've got a recognised trade union, then that consultation with the unions is really important that you get that right and that you get engaged with the trade unions from the outset and get their buy-in to what you're proposing to do.
Can I just cut in there, Helen, in relation to the consultation process? The decision ultimately is one for the business to make. So whilst you are required to consult with trade union reps, if you have them, their health and safety reps, you don't have to reach agreement with them. Of course, the risk, as schools and colleges are finding out at the moment, is that if you can't reach agreement on them, then they will ask their members to strike, and obviously they have to go through the ballot requirements, but that's the ultimate risk. You can't reach agreement. And even if you're not unionised, you still have an obligation to consult with your staff about these health and safety risk assessments. And that means that you either keep them informed individually or you liaise with a group of representatives within the workforce who then disseminate that information to the rest of the workforce. But I think given how unsettled and how uncertain a lot of people feel about coming back to work, it's worthwhile sharing all of that information with your staff to try and reassure them that you've done the right thing, you've put in place all of the measures that are reasonable to protect them as best you can. And you're also required to publish that on your website as well so that it's available that way.
Yeah, absolutely. Being transparent with your workforce has been critical. And I know of many, many businesses that have gone through brilliant processes where they're updating on a weekly basis and making sure that staff feel reassured and informed. And I think that's what employees are going to want. That's going to minimise the risk of grievances, of resignations. You know, ultimately that's the worst case scenario that you're facing, and potentially tribunal claims. If you are recognised, if you do have a recognised union, then any kind of trade union dispute. So good communication, it sounds so obvious, but it's absolutely critical to making sure that we get the next phase and we transition into the next phase as well as we possibly can do. So Jo, in terms of staff who are shielding or are vulnerable, I think that's been a real concern for clients that I've seen over the last few weeks. And then, as we said, that's really going to increase as we look to try and get staff back into work. So what's your view on staff who are shielding and those vulnerable staff that are potentially disabled?
Well, certainly shielding staff, the advice is unequivocal: stay at home. You can't return to work. If you can work from home, then that's absolutely fine. But if you can't, you have to stay at home, which is why lots of employers have considered furloughing those shielded staff. And that's why this disconnect between the official, sorry, my dogs are going mad, the official rules and the employer guidance is so critical and still unamended. That's a potential problem. However, if you are in the vulnerable group, that will include people who are pregnant, that will include people who are 70 or over, as well as lots that have other underlying health conditions. Now, obviously, you need to be particularly careful with those, and the government have said that they also need to take particularly stringent measures in relation to social distancing. So if you can't socially distance them within your workplace for whatever reason, then you need to look at other ways in which you can protect them. And that's really a question for your risk assessment. It may be that you can assign them to a different role, which takes them out of the public arena, for example, or ultimately continue to allow them to work from home if that's possible. And then you've got protection for these people anyway. So if individuals believe that their workplace poses a imminent risk or danger to their health and safety, then they do have rights under the Employment Rights Act to not return to work or to walk out if they consider that the measures that you've put in place aren't sufficient to satisfy them. So I think that the advice really to employers is to talk to these people, find out what their concerns are, try and resolve those amicably if you can. And if you can't, then that's the point at which you need to take advice, particularly if these individuals do have a disability, because obviously disabled people have additional rights. And in particular, as an employer, you have a duty to make reasonable adjustments. And that's something that you'll probably need to talk to legal advisors about, because reasonable adjustments are generally designed to get people back to work, not to make them more comfortable if they are off work.
Whilst we're on the subject of shielding, Joe, I think we've had a question in from one of the delegates. So it says we've interpreted the information on the .gov website that we could furlough those who presented an NHS letter and therefore were shielding. Have we misunderstood that?
No, you absolutely haven't misunderstood the government guidance to employers. It is absolutely clear on that point. What is uncertain now is the fact that the official rules which HMRC have to follow when they're looking at people who have been furloughed say the opposite. And that's the difficulty. As I said earlier, the government have said in response to complaints that their advice is inconsistent, have said all employers need to do is to consider the advice that's available to them, and they don't need to worry about the detailed rules. Well, that clearly is your argument if HMRC at a later date come back and say, well, actually, our rules said this.
Okay, and we've had another question on this actually. So what are the guidelines for people living with shielded people? What would you say if you're living with someone that should be shielding?
Well, absolutely, they can be furloughed. And I think generally that's the right thing to do. I have a friend who has a really awful type of blood cancer, and her husband worked in a supermarket. So he was a frontline worker, he was considered to be a key worker, and he was out on the floor every day. And they were really, really concerned that he developed coronavirus and brings it home, his wife would die. I wrote to his employer on his behalf, and they have now furloughed him for the foreseeable future. And I think you have to look at these things on a case-by-case basis. But essentially, if you've got somebody who is living in very close proximity to somebody with that's considered to be clinically extremely vulnerable, then you do need to listen very carefully to what they're saying. I mean, the government originally said that you needed to consider things like whether you can socially isolate from that person within their own home. But obviously that depends on many things, not least how crowded their house is. And if you're living in a small house, you're sharing the same bedroom as someone that's shielded, the same bathroom, I think it's very, very difficult not to sort of, be able to prevent them bringing the virus back home if they somehow pick it up at work.
Yeah, so if shielding, you must stay at home, and if vulnerable, then the employer must be particularly stringent in following social distancing measures. You've got the legislation there. It's the Employment Rights Act, which protects employees from dismissal or detriment where they reasonably believe they are in serious and imminent danger and refuse to work. So that's obviously the point that Joe covered off there. So thank you for that, Joe. So staff who are shielding or are vulnerable, we've just set out there on the slides that hopefully you can see. What can you do where staff are shielding or vulnerable and can't carry out their duties at home? So just a bit of a summary there for you of the current position. If they're shielding, then try to transfer them to a home-based job. You've got the option of paying SSP or furlough. So obviously Joe was very much encouraging businesses to think about furlough for those types of staff. If you've got vulnerable staff, then you're looking at adjusting the working conditions, potentially providing PPE if there's issues around social distancing, And then ultimately, you could treat them as on sick leave, pay them sick pay, or the option of furlough as well.
I just wanted to cut in there and talk very briefly about PPE, because what the government has said in these 8 documents is that employers shouldn't be providing PPE as a precautionary measure, and that PPE is only required where you ordinarily provide it to members of staff. And obviously, the idea behind that is because we haven't got enough PPE in this country, and they want most of it to be directed to frontline staff. So whilst as an employer your duty is to consider health and safety and to provide PPE, you may find it very difficult to obtain the relevant and appropriate types of PPE that you need to properly protect members of staff. Therefore, if you can't provide PPE, and that's the only safe way in which these vulnerable groups can continue to work, then you've got to think about other options.
Yeah, understood. I mean, it's a big ask of employers, isn't it, to be able to start thinking about this. So pregnant women, that's obviously another area of concern if you've got staff that are pregnant. So many additional rights to individuals that are vulnerable. Thinking about risk assessments that we've mentioned, that obviously applies once you know an employee is pregnant. So you must look at altering the working conditions or hours of work to see if that will then avoid the significant risk that the member of staff might face. So we've talked about PPE. Obviously, the best thing to do is to work from home if they possibly can, and look at social distancing. Now, where that's not possible, you're looking at offering suitable alternative work on terms that aren't substantially less favourable. And then ultimately, if neither of those are possible, then you've got the option to suspend on full pay, which isn't ideal. So obviously it's trying to reach a compromise to make sure that your pregnant member of staff is safe. One question we did get from a client is about, well, can we ask them to start their maternity leave early? And you can't do that, so that's not possible. So unless she's absent from work with a pregnancy-related illness, which starts or continues from the beginning of the 4th week before expected week of childbirth. So I'd say it's definitely worth getting some support if you've got concerns around a pregnant employee. There are additional risks around that. Now, we're going to have a lot of staff who are afraid to return to work. So you might have employees that just don't want to come back. They might live with someone that's shielding, which we've mentioned, obviously. Now, all employees are protected from dismissal or a detriment if they refuse to attend work, if they reasonably believe there is serious and imminent risk to health. Now, obviously, Jo, we're in a situation right now where that could apply throughout, couldn't it? So what would you say in terms of the best options for employers?
Well, you look at this from the point of view of what the employee believes. So even if as an employer you don't agree with them, that's not the point. The point is, did the employee have a genuine belief that their health, or indeed that of others, it doesn't just have to relate to their health, it can relate to their co-workers' health, it can relate to members of the public and their family members. So if they believe that they are going into a workplace that puts their health in serious danger, then they can walk off site, refuse to go back until such steps are taken to alleviate that danger. Now, there is a bit of a disconnect, I think, and this is my personal opinion, between what the government is saying and what other scientists are saying about the risks to public health. Now, the government, certainly this week, seem to be minimising that a little bit. They're talking about the idea that you should be, is it vigilant or something like that? I can't remember. They've taken, they've changed the slogans, haven't they?
Stay alert.
Oh, that's it. Stay alert, as if these bugs can be seen, if only. So there is a disconnect, I think, between what the government is saying to people and what they may be reading elsewhere. Some of you may have seen that the Alternative Stage Group, for example, and that's a group of scientists that don't advise the government. These are an independent group of scientists, and they have said publicly that they believe that the steps that the government has taken aren't appropriate, and they've actually said that they are dangerous and may cause a further spike in coronavirus cases unless they are accompanied by appropriate testing and tracking and tracing mechanisms, which, as we know, are not yet in place. So in that context, it's easy to see how somebody will be able to genuinely say, actually, I don't think it's safe for me to return to work. And, you know, there's various scientists that also believe that. I think the only thing that employers can do in those circumstances are to discuss their health and safety measures with their staff, be completely open about how they have reached the decisions that they have, and try and alleviate staff concerns. Now, obviously, if they have significant numbers of people that are refusing to come into work, then that's going to cause a huge problem for them. And they will need to take specific advice on that, because in some circumstances, they will be able to discipline or indeed dismiss members of staff, but they have to be absolutely really careful about that. And today isn't the forum for us to discuss that, because it requires specific advice in order to avoid the sorts of issues that you've outlined, Helen, and that is automatic unfair dismissals or detriment claims, which can be extremely expensive. In relation to a successful unfair dismissal claim, for example, automatic, there's no cap on the amount of compensation that can be claimed.
And that's a question that we've had in, so thank you for that question. If we can't provide the PPE, are the employees protected if they decide to just leave work? And I think you're saying they are.
They are, but only if it's reasonable for them to do so. But that, as I say, that has to be looked at from their point of view, which is why you need to understand exactly why they are fearful. And it could be that they're fearful because of the way in which they have to travel into work. So if you're using public transport, for example, that may well be the issue. And it may be that you might be able to put different forms of transport in place for members of staff. Equally, it could be the actual work environment itself. So if, for example, if you are working in a supermarket and you are stacking shelves or you're filling trolleys for these people that are shopping online, then you are coming into contact regularly with members of the public who may or may not have the virus. I think in those circumstances, then you need to be looking at what other work maybe these people can do that takes them out of that type of environment and puts them in a safer environment. I mean, there's no way in which employers will be able to completely eliminate risk, and there's no requirement for employers to eliminate risk. But what they have to do is reduce it to its lowest possible level.
We've had a follow-up question from that. So we're talking about ideally allowing the employee to work from home if that's possible, or taking unpaid leave. And the question is, if they can't work and they don't want to work, would the leave be unpaid if we have work for them to do?
So this is somebody that's in a vulnerable group, did you say, Helen, or not?
Just specify, no, it's just if they feel that they're not safe and they leave work.
Well, that will depend on the reasons why they don't feel that their workplace is safe, and you would have to discuss those with them and try and reach an agreement. You'd only be able to dock their pay or push them onto some sort of unpaid leave if you do not believe that they have a genuine belief that their health is in serious and imminent danger. And as I say, that's why you need to take specific advice on those sorts of issues. It's impossible for us to be able to give you advice here today that would apply to everybody.
And then if we're looking at the transport point, so we've had another question come in. So if people are refusing to come into work when they're reliant on public transport, they're scared to use the bus or the train, should they have to accept unpaid leave, and how long for?
Well, your health and safety assessment should look at the ways in which they can safely get into work. And if they can't get into work safely because, for example, they are using crowded public transport services, then I don't think that you can force them into work, because that potentially will put them at risk of catching the coronavirus. And not only that, but then possibly transmitting it within your workplace. So again, that's something that you're going to need to look at on an individual basis and see whether there are any alternatives. I'm sorry, I'm sorry that I keep saying it depends, but it very much does depend on individual circumstances.
Absolutely. And then talking about that, so we've got staff with caring responsibilities. Obviously, staff with children may not be able to return immediately until the schools are back. We've had a guidance from the government to say when that might happen, when that might start to happen before the summer holidays, but that's not going to help all staff. So that's a real issue that you need to think about as well as an employer.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely pointless asking staff to return to work if they're looking after their children. You simply can't, you can't do so. If you try and force them into work when you know that they are looking after children at home, then it will undermine the implied duty of trust and confidence that you owe your staff. And if they choose to, they could resign and claim constructive unfair dismissal.
Yeah.
You need to look at other options. And furlough.
And those are the options, Jo. So if they can't work from home,
I'd consider furloughing.
Yeah.
Because you can't pay them sick pay because they're not sick. They're not eligible under the SSP scheme. You need to be looking at alternatives. So furloughing would be one alternative. Unpaid leave would be another alternative. Parental leave would be another alternative. But again, that's all unpaid.
Yeah.
You could also allow them to take some of their holiday. So obviously people continue to accrue holiday at the moment. You could ask them to take, say, 4 weeks holiday all in one block if you wanted to as well, if that would help them out. There's lots of things that you can think about.
Yeah. Okay. So
did we also have one in relation to pregnancy?
Sorry, say again?
I think we've also had a question in relation to pregnancy. And this is, if a pregnant employee currently 12 weeks can work from home, how long is reasonable to allow this arrangement to continue? Can they request this for the duration of their pregnancy? Well, I'll answer that if you like, Helen. The answer to that is yes. Pregnant women are in the vulnerable category. You have to take steps to protect their health and safety. And if you can't minimise risk, then you have to suspend them on full pay. There's no discretion about it. You have to suspend them on full pay. And you don't mess about with pregnant women in the sense that they have elevated employment rights. If you get those wrong, they can be extremely costly. The evidence in relation to pregnant women is a little uncertain at the moment. But what is emerging is that certainly in their third trimester, they appear to be more at risk than at earlier stages in their pregnancy. But the government guidance doesn't differentiate between different trimesters. It simply says that if you are pregnant, then you need to be given a job that puts you at the least risk compared to anyone else in the organisation.
Okay, lots to think about. Before we move off the subject of furlough, I'm just going to deal with one of the questions that's come in. So, can you invite a furloughed employee to an investigation or a disciplinary as part of a disciplinary process? What's your view on that, Jo?
We're not sure about that. I mean, if you want to be risk averse, then the answer is just keep them at home. I know some employers are still dealing with disciplinary and grievance issues, but it's far from clear whether or not that will breach the no work conditions in the furlough guidance note.
And we know that trade union reps can be asked to be involved in consultation whilst furloughed.
Yeah.
But there's no guidance specifically on employees that are going through that particular process.
There isn't, no.
Okay.
I think we're going to have to move on because we're going to run out of time otherwise.
Yeah, lots of really good questions, so thank you for that. So we're just going to move on to changing terms and conditions and what you need to do when you're looking to bring staff back. So you do need to consider contractual changes, such as pay, hours, when you're bringing staff back. Now, many of these changes, or most changes, will require employee consent beforehand, and you have to go through a consultation process to achieve that. So looking at what changes you want to make, obviously that's the key point, and that might be something that you need to get advice on. Less is more, I think, in this situation, so only change what you need to change. Starting point would be to see if you have an express contractual right to make the change. So that might allow you to go ahead and do it. There might be some discretion there to make the change, but do be very, very careful with those types of flexible clauses when you're making contractual changes. The language has to be unambiguous and clear, and if you're relying on discretion, then it must be exercised carefully, otherwise there is that risk of breaching the implied duty of trust and confidence. So do get advice when you're looking to go through a consultation process to change terms. If you don't have a flexibility clause to enable you to make the change that you want to make, so it might be a reduction of pay, it might be a reduction of hours, might be a change to the daily working pattern, then ultimately, and this is really a very last resort, you could potentially look at dismissing on notice and re-engaging on the new terms. Now, that would be a sum of the substantial reason process, and it's really important that you do get advice if you haven't gone through that process before, because there's high risk, obviously, of an unfair dismissal claim. And there might also be collective consultation obligations around that as well. And then you'd have to go through a formal consultation process for a set period of time. So we will come on to that in a bit more detail, but I just wanted to flag that here. Now, obviously, the key point, and we talked about communication. So you must have made thorough attempts to persuade employees to agree to the variation. There must be, sound business reasons that you've properly communicated to them, any kind of language of agreeing or be dismissed is not what we want to be doing right now. That's not appropriate and is going to cause you to be at high risk of a constructive dismissal claim. So communication really, really important. We touched on collective consultation, and that is where you are looking to dismiss as redundant 20 or more staff at one establishment within a period of 90 days or less. That's the key test that you're looking at, and if you can keep the numbers beneath 20, then great. That means that you avoid this more complex process that you'd have to go through. When you're looking at changing terms, there is the possibility that the dismissal that I mentioned on the grounds of some of the substantial reason, that could also apply to these cases where you're ultimately looking to dismiss and re-engage employees on the new terms. So just bear in mind that if you're changing terms, if it's going to affect 20 or more staff, you might need to go through this collective consultation process that we're discussing now. The risk, if you don't, is a protective award of up to 90 days gross pay per employee. So it's expensive if you get it wrong, so do be careful. So just moving on to redundancies then. Now, ultimately, many of our clients are already looking at that. They have potentially put it on hold due to the announcements this week. But restructuring and redundancies might be something that you need to think about in addition to changing terms and conditions. These circumstances are extraordinary. Unprecedented is a word that we're hearing a lot at the moment, and it's a bit of a cliche, but it's absolutely true. So regardless of that, there are no excuses. You do need to follow your legal obligations when completing any of these kind of processes, and particularly redundancy. So if you're making 20 or more employees redundant within that 90-day period, remember you must go through the collective consultation process. There's minimum periods that apply for the consultation. So you've got 30 days if you've got between 20 and 99 staff to be made redundant, 45 days consultation if it's 100 or more. Really important that you notify the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy via the Form HR1. So that's important that you do that right at the start. It's a criminal offence if you don't, and there are fines. So do get advice around that. And you have to remember, it's not just the collective process. It's not just consulting with either the trade union representatives or the elected employee representatives, you have to factor in enough time to consult individually. So obviously think about, do you have elected representatives already? Do you have trade union representatives? If not, you're going to have to go through an election process. That could be tricky if they are working from home or furloughed. So you may have to adapt processes, but you can ultimately carry on with consultation. And then thinking about notice and redundancy pay, so the usual rules apply. Employees are entitled to notice prior to being made redundant and a redundancy payment if they've worked for 2 years or more. They can serve notice during furlough, and you may be able to base the notice pay on the reduced furlough pay. It all depends on the type of contract. So do take advice if you're not sure. We think that probably you can use furlough grants towards notice payments. It's not entirely clear, but again, I'd say get some advice around that if you're not certain. So in terms of redundancy pay, as I say, you may be able to base payments on furlough pay. Safest course of action is to base it on pre-furlough pay, but you can't use the furlough grant to meet the redundancy payments. So that is clear. Some issues around collective consultation. So employee representatives can perform duties, as we said, without breaching that no work rule if they're on furlough. And you can consult with furloughed employees about proposed redundancies without breaching those rules. So just bear that in mind that you can continue with the process. So that brings us to the end of the webinar. We hope it's been very helpful. There's been lots of really great questions, so thank you very much for those. I'm just going to hand back with the last couple of minutes there back to Susie, but thank you very much for joining us, and do get in touch if we can help you on any of your specific concerns. Thanks, Susie.
Do you mind if I interject just for a second, Susie, because we've had lots of questions that have come up recently that we've not actually had time to answer. There's quite a bit there on holiday and furlough and some other issues. We publish regular updates on all of these things, and I've certainly got guidance notes on holiday and various other things that you might find useful. If you don't already sign up to receive our updates, you can do so via our coronavirus pages. But if you're not sure how to find those and you want specific documents that we've already published, if you let me know, and my details will be at the end of the slide, I can direct you to the correct place to sign up for updates and let you have those that we've already published. I'm glad that so many of you were able to join us today. As Helen said, I hope that you found this useful. I appreciate that we've not been able to answer all of the questions that came through. We've been inundated, actually, which is good to see. And I do feel your frustration. This is a really difficult time for businesses. You're being asked to make changes quickly and to adapt to a situation none of us have faced before. As I say, we produce regular updates, very client-focused pieces of information. If you need any of that, please let me know, and I will direct you to the information that is freely available to clients and other people that view our website. Many thanks.
And I just add to that, Jo. So I think Susie was going to mention that there is a brief survey that will be sent out to you after. So if you could fill that in, that will then enable you to request the bulletins that Jo has mentioned, so you can be updated. And it will also help us in terms of planning for our future webinars that we do, so you can feed in any requests for particular topics. But thank you very much for joining us. I hope it's been helpful, and have a great day. Thank you.